introduce our guest speaker. Matt Sment is a well-known Tenkara expert. He lectures frequently, he guides. He just actually came from a something like a 1-week Tenkara jamboree in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. If he looks a little bit rough around the edges, it's because he's been doing a lot of camping and catching some fish. He was also one of the founders of Badger Tenkara, if you're familiar with that. I asked one of our chapter members who loves Tenkara and knows a lot more about it than I do, who we ought to have as a Tenkara lecturer. And he said, you got to call Matt Smet, which I did. So we're really happy to welcome you, Matt. And I'd like to ask you to join us. I'm going to drive your slides, and we need to get you trekking on the video.
All right. Do I have to do like a dance or something? That's my only move, I'm sorry. There we go. 1, 2, 1, 2. We all good? All right, good evening. My name is Matt, and I have to talk to you about our fly fishing. And I'm very excited to do so. One, because this is probably the biggest turnout at a TU meeting that I've seen. So thanks for coming out. Give yourself a round of applause. And also because I've been several years. You typically don't want to drive past fish, and so I can't. Too many good trout. But finally, I have an excuse up here, so thank you. And I, anybody that wants to give up some intel on some good water, Sorry. Oh man, that. Just want to tell you about my car journey before we get started. I was a very visual really not a lot of anglers in my family at all. And 2013, one of my best friends who I've known, who we've principals off together since we were like this. Anyway, he suggested to me the idea of Tenkara is small and lightweight. I was having problems and looking for more lightweight equipment. And he took me out fishing one day on a brook trout stream down in Wisconsin, and I caught nothing, but I moved a couple little brook trout that came up and gave me the old, nosy refusal thing. And I was like, oh, you didn't. And I went home that night. I ordered all my own gear, and from then every waking moment pretty much for the next several years was spent focused on learning Tenkara. And about a year after that, my friend Mike and I started Badger Tenkara, which was a Tenkara rod company for about 6 years or so. Since then, I've been doing a lot of traveling, frankly, and I currently work as a editor for TenkaraAngler.com, managing education and classes and doing other content and stuff for that. But without further ado, let's actually get into the presentation. So if we could move on to the next, please. So we're going to talk about the origins of Tenkara. So first of all, the word Tenkara translates from Japanese into English pretty close to from the heavens. And what it refers to is the fly floating down out of the sky. Pretty poetic thing. An interesting thing to note about this is, it's called Tenkara because that's a word they picked up in the particular region that we first encountered it back in the 1800s. And other people in Japan may have been calling it something else for a very long time. We'll kind of get into the regionality of this style of fishing in a moment. But Tenkara was developed in the mountainous regions of Japan. both by people who lived in villages and were fishing to feed themselves and take fish to market. And we've come to find out nomadic bear hunters, clans of nomadic bear hunters who used to go up into the mountains every season and hunt bears and live in caves. And they needed quick sustenance while they were up there. So they would use Tenkara style fishing to catch their fish. In addition to that, they started doing what I would consider some early conservation work and some early stocking work, because they found the fish population they were targeting were in the lower portions of the stream and they wanted to hunt bear further up. So every time they went up, they would take buckets full of fish with them and stock further and further above the falls until they had a fishery that they could use while they were hunting bears. It's really cool to me to know that Tenkara is a frontier art, is a frontier style of fishing. And that to me connects, I'm big into American frontier history. Our history, I'm originally from Rockford, Illinois, down there. I spent about half of my life running around in Wisconsin as well. And this to me is an area rich in frontier history. So I like to kind of bring that parallel together a little bit. But we talked about the bear hunters. We first encountered this as English-speaking Europeans in the 1800s, and it's still been very slowly trickling over to the United States. So let's talk about Tenkara in Japan. So the Japanese are very, very specific about naming things, and they're also very specific about their fishing. If there's anything in Japan that fishes, and probably outside of Japan that swims, the Japanese fish for it. And they have a highly developed style and set of equipment for it, all the way down to a style of fishing similar to Tenkara that is fixed line called Tanago, which is about catching the smallest fish you possibly can. The challenge in that is to catch a fish that will only cover up a 1 yen coin. Now, I do that accidentally like all the time, but I guess if that's your goal, then that's a lot harder to do. So they traditionally define Tenkara as fishing for native trout on high gradient mountain streams with wet flies. It's pretty specific, and frankly, a Tenkara purist should easily tell me that on spring creeks down here in Wisconsin, where I've developed my style, that technically isn't Tenkara. That's okay. They can tell me that all day long. The techniques still work great on the water, and it's still a highly relevant way to fish. And there's also a lot of good fishing to be done out there with Tenkara rods that isn't necessarily Tenkara. Throwing micro poppers at smallmouth bass on a Tenkara rod is some of the most fun you'll ever have. You'll be laughing like a kid. But that's technically not really Tenkara. So I do some Tenkara rod fishing. I try to focus on Tenkara as a style. However you fish with the equipment you have or pick up is fine. Just know that there is a kind of a spectrum from what is traditionally defined as Tenkara fishing in Japan and has come over the United States, and just anything you can do with a fixed line fly rod. So Tenkara is very regionally focused. As we talk about when we get to flies, these mountain villages that developed the style were all relatively isolated from each other, and the anglers were typically only fishing their waters, so they only needed a fly that worked on their water. So they would there were regional development into a few samples of that later that reflect that specific village on that specific fishery, or that specific village on that specific fishery. Now, truth be told, those flies are probably going to catch fish on either, but the development has been highly anchored in that regionality from the beginning. There's a phrase that used to kick around called 10 colors of Tenkara, which simply means that there are various ways to approach it, that while there are principles, while there are core ideas, it's your style. And I typically believe that anybody who picks up a Tenkara rod is essentially reinventing Tenkara when they do it for themselves. I think the same could be said with a conventional fly fishing rig as well. It's important to remember that even in Japan, Tenkara is a niche within a niche. As fly anglers, those of us out here that are, we know we're actually a small percentage of fishing compared to the much larger fishing community that uses reels and bait and all that stuff. And even so, within that, even in Japan, Tenkara is incredibly small niche. And it's been an interesting effect that over the last 10 or 15 years, as Americans have become interested in Tenkara, it has resurged a Japanese interest in Tenkara, to the fact that Japanese people are buying American company Tenkara rods to be cool, while most American anglers are trying to get Japanese produced Tenkara rods. It's really been an interesting reflex, I think, in the Japanese community. So let me stop for a moment here and ask a couple questions. How many people in here already have a Tenkara rod, already fishing, enjoying Tenkara? Quite a bit. Wow, awesome. Great to see. Okay, so the next question is, how many people in here are pretty sure Tenkara is pretty much just like a rebranded cane pole? Okay, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. If you're looking at the length of the rod, it's really easy to get that impression. But what we're going to talk about for a moment here is the differences in how rods and poles react, and how a Tenkara rod is definitely not a pole. So when you're fishing a pole, and this is one thing I'll throw out here to you, you talk to pole fishermen, they're not using Tenkara rods because that's the wrong tool for the job. And the reason is that a Tenkara rod has a completely different flex profile. It's got more flex than you would want. If you're fishing with a pole, you want that thing rigid all the way out, particularly on the tip, right? Because you've got to be able to set a hook and lift that fish out there. So you don't want a lot of flex in that pole. With a Tenkara rod, there is a specific flex profile that allows you to throw light line in a way that a cane pole never could. Levels of accuracy and control over the fly that a cane pole never could. I don't want to say never. Like maybe you take a cane pole out and live in the woods for 50 years and do all the grasshopper stuff with carrying buckets of water and training and stuff. Maybe you could, I don't know. But the pole is not designed to do that. So the main difference between a fishing pole and a Tenkara rod is that flex profile, which enables the rod to throw a light line. All right, okay, so let's talk about Tenkara rods. Just a few facts here. They're typically between 10 and 15 feet, 11 to 12 feet high. They typically weigh 3 ounces or less, lash down, pretty short, but they have a very goofy kind of way that they're rated. Everybody's here is familiar with conventional fly rods using 4-weight, 5-weight, 6-weight, all that stuff. So Tenkara rods don't have that at all. What Japanese manufacturers have used for a long time has been a flex ratio that is supposed to describe to you where the rod begins to bend. So you have at the softer end of the flex ratios, you have a 5-5, which means that the rod bends right there in the middle, 50% up the rod. A 6-4 has a little bit higher, about 60%. And a 7-3, it bends a little higher up there. Now, the problem we run into is that there was never any standard agreed upon between the manufacturers in Japan as to what 5-5, 6-4, and 7-3 actually meant. So you can pick up a 6-4 from one brand and a 6-4 from another, and they don't fish the same. They don't feel the same. Unfortunately, it's very hard to get a feel for a Tenkara rod without putting your hands and doing what we very scientifically call the wiggle test, and just see how it moves. So it's a good those ratios you will see on rods are a good indicator of where a rod may be bending for you, but it's never going to be a hard, fast thing like, hey, this is a 4-weight. I know this is going to be, able to work within these capabilities. Now, that being said, the rods are quite capable, if we will. Okay, so let's talk about the Tenkara triangle. And that is basically I don't want to say the secret, but it's the core principle of what makes Tenkara work. Now, we all know that when we cast conventional fly rods, we drop the tip and we in parallel with the line, with the rod, kind of parallel to the water, right? Okay, so the thing with the Tenkara rod is you want to stop that rod instead of down here where you're ending up conventional cast, you want to stop it up here. And what this does, it uses the length of the rod to keep the line off the water. So you guys know about mending, right? It's a discipline that all fly fishermen have to deal with, except for Tenkara anglers, because our line isn't on the water. Any mending we do is in the air when we're casting. That's some advanced stuff, aerial mending, but those currents that are throwing conventional anglers' line off in the water and causing all that drag, we're not anywhere near them. And that's why the entire style is predicated on that high tip stop and then maintaining line tension. So let's move on one more. So this is me several years ago, and you can see that is the correct end position there. If not, maybe a little bit low. I was probably reaching out across that longer piece of water. Next, please. Okay, so not the Tenkara triangle, and keep the rod tip low like this. You can hold hold it low and dunk and dap, and you will catch fish, but you will negate the maximum advantages of the system. You will have line on the water. Therefore, you'll be causing drag and ensure that you don't have to. So no one's going to force you to stop the rod tip high, but if you want to get every potential advantage out of the Tenkara system, that's the way you would do it. And I'm going to see what I can do in here to try to demonstrate that. Oh, by the way, because you showed up in person, y'all get premium content tonight. After the portion of the meeting, I'll be giving a casting demonstration out in the park, natural environment of the parking lot. Okay, so let's look a little bit at this cast and just see where it kind of ends up. And this is a Dragon Tail Kaida rod that's a little bit shorter. It's an adjustable rod. I'm going to use it in its shortest position here to see if we can do a little something here. But I think this is a good way to do this. So we're starting in a position like this when we're casting. And you'll see that I have my arm tucked in. If you spend all your time up here fishing with this rod, even if it's 2 or 3 ounces, you're going to be smoked by the end of the day. You're not going to be able to move your arm. You want to tuck that thing down here. But you start the cast about here, and then you would come up and back. Actually, a lot of my cast is just in this arc right here. And it's just 1, 2. And you'll see I'm doing this, and I'm not trying to imitate the rod. Typically, if you can do it comfortably, the ideal grip on a Tenkara rod is with your index finger forward like this. Can you all see how I've got the index finger up on the blank or on the grip here versus your kind of thumb position that you usually do with a conventional rod? And the reason for that is that with your finger extended, it actually limits the motions that your hand can make. Okay, if you're all like this, your wrist can go all over the place. Biomechanically, if you channel your hand a little bit, you get a lot more control. And very often, I will look up onto the blank itself with finger on that rod for a little bit more accuracy and a little bit more strike detection. But I can also fish it from down here to get an extra, depending on how much the length of the grip is, I can get sometimes an extra foot out of the rod just by changing my hand position. But the index finger up is the ideal position for control. If it hurts you, don't do it, find another way, but that's what you're looking for. That's the next slide. Yeah, so that's just a good sized brown that we caught on Tenkara one day out. We can move on. Okay, same concept. Materials woven together, thicker at one end, tapering to the other end. And those can be awesome. So then we've got level lines, which you may or may not be able to see here, but this is a size 3 level line. This is what I fish a lot. And this is what I'm talking about, throwing light lines. And you can imagine it's a lot harder for the fish to see this over them than it is to see that 5 weight forward PVC line you're throwing. So we also do occasionally fish PVC and floating lines on this. When I'm fishing for smallmouth bass, or even actually out in the Appalachians this last week or two, I was doing a lot of work with small streamers and a very lightweight floating line. I wouldn't ever recommend that you go above a 2 weight on yours because that will begin to really overload it. But a 0, 1, or 2 weight lightweight floating line can make a really excellent Tenkara line, especially if you're throwing larger flies, streamers, or poppers, or something that isn't very aerodynamic. And you're like, what? Streamers? Tenkara? What? Yeah, we're going to get there. But yeah, this is a very lightweight floating line here, as you can see. And this is about as heavy and as visible as any of the Tenkara line choices get. And then there was for a while a big push with all these different types of experimental materials, Kevlar and this, that, and the other thing. That was mostly in furrowed lines. But I would say overall, I think like probably easily 75% of the Tenkara angling community focuses on level lines. And it's because they work very well. Let's move on and take a look at some more specific features of these lines. Okay, so a traditional furrowed line, you can see up here, very close to a furrowed leader that you've seen before. You can get a very delicate, pleasant presentation off these things. I like them particularly for dry flies and surface stuff. And there's 0 line memory to them. So if you can keep them from getting tangled up, they never have to be straightened out. A big disadvantage is that they're not adjustable. You can't decide how long they're going to be. They come pre-made. The other thing that drives me crazy about them is that once they get water in them, they change personality. It's one weight, it does one thing one way, it's wet, it does another thing. I want my equipment to be consistently performing the same way every time I pick it up. So to me, this is not the best choice. And of course, you really can't fish them in the winter because they freeze shut. And to me, like there are a few that are made for subsurface fishing, nymphing and such, but frankly, I don't recommend it for subsurface fishing. I think it's just way too much mass. If we can move on to the next. Okay, so level line, as I just showed you here. And if we want to pass this around, go ahead so you can just see how, thin this stuff is. As I said, absolutely the most popular line used with Tenkara. Most of it is fluorocarbon and high vis. This stuff's yellow. They sell it in green and orange and pink. And I found honestly pink to be probably the color that stands out the most for me in most environments. That's kind of on your own individual eye to decide which is easily spottable for you. Big fan of the delicate presentations you can do with a light line. There's no lighter, there's no gentler way to get a fly in position. And it's easiest for keeping off the water because it's the lightest. Cheap, adjustable, to me, it does pretty much everything you need. It can be difficult to cast off the bat if you're not used to those light lines. So some people like to start off with a heavier line for the first couple months while they're getting used to that casting stroke. As I mentioned, you got visibility problems, and it's not the greatest for like throwing hoppers, like large, plunking non-aerodynamic flies, not the greatest. Yes, sir. Generally, no. The stuff on the spools, not. You can buy pre-made, like 11-foot or 12-foot or what have you, tapered fluorocarbon lines.
Sorry, excuse me, if we have questions that can wait until the end, if you hold to the end, that would be great because we're trying to get Zoom audience to hear the questions. This particular, could you repeat the question?
So the question was, is this level line tapered? And typically, no, that's the term level, but you can buy pre-made sections of fluorocarbon level line that are tapered at various lengths. Okay, and so the other big back to level line is line memory. For instance, I'm really super lazy and we'll just wrap it around the grip of my rod. And when I do, I have to use a little bit of heat on my fingers, straighten it out. But that takes like 10, 15 stints. It's no big deal. And I've only horribly cut myself like twice. No, I'm joking about that. It's safe. Let's move on to the next, please. Okay, floating line. We're all familiar with the PVC floating line, and you know I showed you all here a little bit earlier. But easy to cast, super durable. Frankly, like if you like me have very little pride involved in these sort of things, you can get 100-foot length of fly fishing line for like $8 off of eBay. Especially if you're going to use it for Tenkara line. Like you don't got to go out and buy like Scientific Angler and stuff like that, you know. Just get something cheap that works. It's cost effective. It's wind resistant. You can throw big old chunky flies with it. It's absolutely not a bad choice. It's just being the heaviest of the choices becomes the hardest choice to keep the line off the water, which is again what we're trying to do. Okay, another Wisconsin fish, an old badger bad axe there, named after the Bad Axe River, but let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so let's talk Tenkara flies. The term kabari means simply fly in Japanese. So in the US, when we're talking about flies in the Tenkara community, we want to differentiate between a fly pattern of Japanese origin, we will call it a kabari, or something that's very, very closely inspired by it, and then we'll call American flies, flies, of course. But we differentiate between the Japanese patterns by calling kabari simply the Japanese word fly. Now, the iconic fly that you may have seen is the Sakasa kabari, Sakasa meaning backwards, and that's that rearward facing hackle. We'll take a look at that a little closer here in a moment. We talked about a little bit earlier about regional variations and such. There was a big push in the early 2010s to 2015 or so. Some anglers were doing a thing called one fly, where they basically pick one pattern and fish that pattern for the season or at all. There are Japanese masters who essentially only fish one or two patterns that they've come up with. And that's because they can make them work. But there's a significant amount of that. So if you've heard of that, you need to know, A, you absolutely can do that. And B, you absolutely don't have to do that. You're not locked in to only choosing one fly. You're never locked in to only use kabari. Your Tenkara rod isn't going to burst into flames if you tie a Royal Coachman or a caddis or a grasshopper on. It's just, just be cognizant that what you're doing is moving farther from that core definition of Tenkara into Tenkara rod fishing, which is still super fun. Okay, let's go ahead and move to the next one there. Okay, so let's talk for a moment about Sakasa, because we said that's reverse hackle, right? And you can see how that's moving against the, towards the tie on there. What you also notice is not metal. In Tenkara, there are ice hooks that some folks tie. I really don't have the skill to mess with it that way, but you end up doing a thread loop to tie on. It looks pretty cool. But long story short, we have Sakasa, which is backwards. Now, if this was to be kind of neutrally oriented, one might say more in like a Palmer hackle, that would be called futsu. So that's middle orientation, and that futsu orientation is usually used with a stiffer hackle material to make a fly that floats on the surface of the water more easily and is more suited for fast water. This Sakasa Well, we'll talk about that in a moment, which is we have to say regular. Okay, so if the hackle is pointing the way that most European and American wet flies point it, which is back towards the hook, it would be Jun, Jun. So we have three hackle orientations in Tenkara: Jun, Futsu, and Sakasa. So basically forward, middle, and backwards. Not particularly complicated. So the reason why you see a Sakasa pattern, and I'm really kind of surprised that this idea hasn't caught on more with flyers in the US, is this allows you to do a technique called the pulse. So we see how that hackle is oriented towards the tide. So when we pull that fly towards us, the water pressure is going to spread out those hackles. And as we stop doing that, it'll close them back up. So doing little tick, tick, you get this swimming, super buggy action. And sometimes all you got to do a dead drift, you know, put that thing on a dead drift about halfway through, just give it a little pop. So it, you know, gives it some motion in that little Sakasa flare, and the fish will just crush it. So that's the idea behind the Sakasa orientation on the hackle, is to give you an extra layer of action on the fly. So we have another very common version of the Kabari is the Takayama Sakasa. So keeping in mind what I've told you guys, just kind of a few things that I've told you all about Kabari so far. Does anybody want to, we know what Sakasa and Kabari means. Does anybody who doesn't already know because they're a Tenkara angler want to take a guess at what the Takayama is? It's the region, the village in which this pattern was developed. So this is a Sakasa Kabari of the Takayama region. And all it is essentially a peacock curl collar added to the standard Sakasa pattern. But that is the signature pattern of Takayama region. All right. So non-Kabari Kabari. So I'm talking with my friend several years ago, talking about the regional origin of Japanese Kabari, and I said, buddy, what I really need to do is find wet fly patterns that originated in Wisconsin, because then I'll be like really on my Tenkara, right? I'll be fishing a regional wet fly in the region that it was developed. And he said, oh, you got to try the Pass Lake. I'll send you a couple dozen. Anybody here fish the Pass Lake? We got some true believers out there. You guys know the power. This fly will catch you fish. I will say anywhere on earth. I haven't trout outside the confines of the US, but I can't find any trout that won't bite it. I'm not saying every trout will bite it every time, but it works everywhere I go. So this to me has become my go-to fly since then. I fish it to great effect in Wisconsin. Size 12, size 10, even up to size 8. Throw a size 6 at smallmouth bass and hold on. They will crush it as soon as it hits. I have no idea. And I bet even if the fish could talk, they don't have any idea what this is supposed to be. But it looks like food. And I'll tell you, the interesting thing about this pattern is I've never seen so many fish that will charge out of cover, and instead of hitting it, they'll just stop and they'll swim around it. Like, what is that? I don't know. I'm just going to hit it and go back after it. But that's something that happens like a half dozen times a summer, and I never really see it happen much with any other flies. So I think they're just as puzzled as what it is as I am, but just as willing to eat it as I am to throw it at them. So I'm just going to keep fishing it. Another thing that was really big in the community and is still pretty strong is the Utah killer bug. So it's a variation of a fly called the killer bug. Is anyone here familiar with Frank Sawyer, the famous Frank Sawyer river keeper in England? Okay, so he had a problem, like, I can't remember if he was supposed to get the trout out of the river or the grayling out of the river. It was one of the two species. He's managing the river, and he found it faster to just catch the fish with this fly than it was to like net them up and do it that way. So it was pretty effective for him. The thing is, you can't really find the wool that he used for it. So now we're using, we found some wool yarns here in the US, and that's what this is simply a wool yarn wrapped around the hook, on with a pink hotspot. And this will catch you fish everywhere too. I mean, it looks like, it just looks buggy, right? I mean, I'm almost a little bit hungry when I look at that thing. So these are just some examples of some popular flies to fish. And, you know, I got asked specifically earlier, I want to address this. Yes, you can fish beadheads. Yes, you can fish small streamers. Yes, you can fish small poppers. If you're like me, you can probably fish things that are irresponsibly large. You shouldn't tell people in public, because then they'll try to do it and break their stuff. But long story short, these rods will hold up if you use them right. And don't be afraid to try whatever fly you're used to using on a Tenkara rod. Okay, so let's talk just a little. We're working with flies. We like to sink them and get them into position. Do a lot of casting. If I'm looking at right there, I'm going to be casting up and moving it. And that one up and over, so I can use that line tension to, even if I don't need the wet fly and line tension, I can pin that fly to the surface, making it float. And I can't take a floating fly on it too. So I'll stick wet fly, because then I've got the utility of being able to get it low or do to so I don't rely on the material to look for me. That's all line tension and tip control. So we talked about the pulse a little bit earlier. Everything is usually a dead drift. And then after that, I get a little bit of action. And then by the end, if it's a nymph or a streamer, I'm zipping across the top and zipping it back upstream. And you never know. Like it moves a lot of fish, actually, just taking, like, at the end of a drift with a nymph, but then jig it back up towards you. They'll hit it. off of a Tenkara rod, and probably maybe closer to a size 8 is more appropriate with weight. Does that answer your question? You know, I have seen some people use like even like split shot type stuff, depending on like their nymphing rigs. Because some people do go way down the rabbit hole with kind of bringing Euro nymphing and that level of nymphing and rating into the Tenkara side. I don't. I'm I'm not going to say like, I'm going to say efficient, not lazy. But I just want a couple lines and try that fly on and get to work. Okay, so hey, we're back. We talked about dead drifts, we talked about active, and so finally the slow lift with, you know, like who here, you know, has gone back to cock back for the next cast and there's a fish on the hook. So that happens a lot, especially with Tenkara. Is, you know, you're drifting stuff through and then you've got a nice tight line and that thing's coming up and you get hit. So hey, incorporate that into your tactics. Like you don't have to wait for that to happen accidentally. Incorporate that lift into your drifts and see what you can make happen. Can we move forward, please?
Yeah, just a second. Sorry, we're still
Yep.
making sure that the audience.
Sir. The question was, are there brand names for Tenkara rods? Yes, there are several American-made rod or American-owned companies and Japanese-owned companies. Japanese names, Nissin, Daiwa, Shimano, stuff you'd probably recognize, you know, by the large catalog of other fishing equipment. American names, Dragon Tail Tenkara, Tenkara USA, Tenkara Rod Company, Tenkara Adventure Outfitters took over the Badger Tenkara catalog after I closed Badger down. You know, and I'll just take this opportunity here and invite you to check out tenkaraangler.com. On there, there should be a link that says starter kit that should be the first tab that says stuff like has like about us and all that sort of stuff about those of us that are doing the project should have a starter kit page, which I've put together to actually kind of direct you to further information about how to choose rods and all that kind of thing. So please check out tenkaraangler.com. Please for starter kit on that. Or start with, there's a great article on the website called The Rule of 12s, which, and this is honestly what I'd recommend to anyone. A great way to start is just get a 12-foot rod, put a 12-foot line on it, and put a size 12 fly on it, and just go fish. That's the best way to do it. But tenkaraangler.com, we've got buyer guides as far as small water rods, big water rods, all sorts of stuff. Hopefully lots of information there, and you can always hit the contact us button and email me and ask me a question there as well. How are we looking?
We're good.
Awesome. Good to have you back there, Zoom folks. I don't know what they may have missed, but we're going to move on to the next page here. Okay, Tenkara FAQ, frequently asked questions. How does it compare to conventional fly fishing? Something I used to get asked a lot when I was doing shows with Badger. And my answer to this is that it's trade-offs. On one hand, with Tenkara, you've got increased precision and control, and most importantly, the ability to keep that line off the water. Now, if you want to trade that precision and control and lightweight line for range or size of payload, you know, then you hop over to conventional and you've got that advantage there. So to me, the major differences between the two is that conventional has adjustable range and potentially, you know, work in larger payloads. But how far do you normally cast when you're trout fishing with a conventional rig? 25, 30 feet? Is anyone booming out 50, 60 foot casts here in the driftless? This guy is, because he's a rock star. But yeah, okay, so on a Tenkara rod, my Tenkara rod, my go-to rod is about 13 feet. I fish a 13 feet line with that and another 4 or 5 feet of tippet. And so that puts me at about 25, 30 feet, depending on how I stand. I can adjust that range depending on how I hold my arm or my body. I can get another 2 or 3 feet out of that if I need to, or less if I need to shorten that up. So I think, especially on this water around here, Tenkara and conventional, it's kind of 6 to 1, half dozen of the other. It really comes down to how you like to catch fish, either in small amounts with conventional or large amounts with Tenkara. No, sorry, I couldn't pass that one up, but no, it comes down to personal preference. Don't in any case, don't ever let anyone tell you you're having fun wrong. Right? Okay, so do I have to use Tenkara flies? We already covered that. Absolutely not. Tie whatever cool stuff's on there. Flies. What about the short casting distance? We just covered that. But here's the big question you've all been wondering the whole time, and like, why did he even wait till the end to do this? How do I catch a fish when there's no reel to bring the fish in? That's the big question. So the answer to that is essentially pretty easily. So we've got the fish on, and we're playing the fish, we're doing our thing, and finally it's ready to come in. So all we got to do at that point is, because that tip is going to move back, and that starts to bring the fish in towards our feet. And if it's played out by that point, we're going to reach out with one hand and kind of grab the line, bring it in those last couple of feet, and scoop it up with the net. So if you go, the longer and longer you go on your system, the more hand lining you might end up doing, which is, to me, like, if you're going to lose a fish, typically it's going to be on the hand lining. In fact, I lost a rainbow that was probably a good 2 feet or so, got it to my feet a week and a half ago, and just went to the tippet just a little too early. We've all heard that. We've all heard that terrible tweaking sound as the tippet gives loose, and then my shriek, which echoed down the valley as that fish swam away. But long story short, it's relatively simple. You tip it back, pull it in, get control of the line, and scoop it up. Once you get practice, you'll get that fish on and off. If you use barbless hooks like me, because I like to just get them back in there fast, your catch and release cycle, 10, 15 seconds maybe. I see people in online discussions talk about Tenkara wearing out the fish and somehow being worse for fish than conventional. I've never seen that. In fact, the vast majority of the fish I see caught with Tenkara are in the net and out before, at least as fast as a conventional angler, if not much quicker. Okay, so has anybody ever heard anything about if you get a big fish on, just throw the rod in the water? Okay, you've heard that. There was a very famous angler pushing that for a while, and I want to ask you not to do that. Okay, so the idea was that you're fighting a big fish and you can't beat it. So you throw the rod in the water. And to me, when I get that fish on, it's me or him. He's either going to break off, or I'm going to put it in the net, or I'm going to fall and explode him. So I'm not much on just getting up on the fish in the middle of it like that. But the idea is then the fish will chill out and swim back to its station. And then you walk back out and pick up the fish and you fight it again. And if you have to throw the rod again, basically you wear the fish out so you can pull it in. We've all seen Jaws, they attach the barrels to the fish. That's the vibe I get off of this. And to me, this is like the opposite of being respectful to the fish. Okay, I mean, we're doing like an alien abduction thing to the fish already. It's relatively rude, but we don't have to pull every ounce of strength out of this fish so that it dies just to catch it, unless you're going to eat it, I suppose. So yeah, I would ask you not to do that, because also you may not get your rod back. Yeah. There's that too. But yeah, I would just ask you to pass on stuff like that. So I want to the next couple pictures that I'm going to show you are just to talk about, we can't catch big fish on Tenkara. So this is guide Kyle Zimpel, who guides down on the Wisconsin River, if y'all familiar with Black Earth Angling Company. Anyway, this was the first smallmouth he ever picked up on this was just a regular 12-foot Tenkara rod that brought this football of a smallmouth in for him. No tippet break, no rod break, no problems, caught the fish. Next slide, please. This is about a 26, 28-inch grass carp with a nice belly. Again, completely caught on a standard 12-footish Tenkara rod. Next. This is the world record holding Tenkara muskie. So several years ago, this is my friend Mike Lutz, who I told you about earlier. He was out with another buddy on opening day of muskie season on the boat. And as you can see in the picture, the weather weren't too good. It was super windy, so they decided to give up. They're throwing conventional rigs. They decided to give up. His buddy was driving the boat back. He had a Tenkara rod rigged up with, as he put it, a big, ugly purple streamer. So he's just kind of throwing off the boat, messing around, and they're, with inside the dock, and he's like, "Oh, I'm snagged on something." Well, this is what he was snagged on. So it's not the biggest muskie ever caught. It's about 36, 37 inches maybe, but at the time, and I think still, it's the biggest muskie ever caught on fish line rods. And having been caught by my best buddy that I've known my whole life, and me not having caught one yet, I'm pretty unhappy about that. So I'm been trying to make things happen for like 6 years now. But long story short, this is all to demonstrate to you that you can catch whatever. There are people that take these things out in the salt water and come off with some good fish. And you might find like a bigger pole, like fish line rod might be better for that than a Tenkara rod. But you'd be surprised what you can make happen. So one more, I think, or are we? Okay, so that has been a fast and brief overview of the equipment and the techniques. Now we're going to take whatever questions the Zoomers have, and then we'll take whatever questions you have, and then we'll go do a casting demo.
Hello.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Hey. All right. We're waiting for questions here. I think they're called thingamabobbers. Hold on one sec. There we go. Any questions from Zoom? All right, let's go to the audience here.
Matt, anybody use droppers on Tenkara rig?
So the question is, does anybody use droppers? So like a dry dropper rig? Absolutely. There's a significant amount of like dry dropper or double nymph rigging going on. In fact, there's an Italian fish line fly fishing style. I'm not going to pronounce it correctly. It's like pesca vesaliana. Long story short, it's a fish line style, and they use 7 flies at a time. Because they're hitting like different levels of the water column. Now, to me, that's losing 7 flies at a time. That's like 48 lines or flies in a tree after 15 minutes. But it's a pretty fascinating way to fish. It really, yeah. So that was.
Do you want to continue with just the audience, then go back to the Zoom?
Okay, so there are Zoom rods. They're not rods that you can only fish on a Zoom meeting, but they are adjustable in their length. And the idea, this one here is this Kata is a Zoom rod. Of course, I've completely, there we go. So you can see here, I'll put it at its short length, and it is essentially locked in at a shorter length, and then you can pop it out. And there are double and triple zooms. I am a big fan of single position rods. I absolutely prefer single position rods. Some people love the Zoom rods. I don't think they're terrible. I think, again, it's a matter of personal preference, but I like a single position rod because you remember when I talked earlier about how I like my gear to be consistent. I like it to do the same thing every time. I think the major drawback with Zoom rods, and it's almost impossible to overcome, is that the action changes as you adjust the length because the physics of the whole thing changes. And that's not a showstopper for most people. For me, I'm just, that's just not a step that I like to take. I like to pick a single position rod that works for me on the terrain I'm fishing, and then fish that there. Next.
Yeah, pretty similar to what was just asked, but so all of the Tenkara rods are telescopic?
Yes. Well, there are some that you can find that are still made of bamboo that you would have to fit together. But for the most part, yes, entirely telescopic these days. All mostly carbon fiber.
In terms of connecting the line to the rod, are there different ways to do that? I've got
Yes.
one that has just a little loop.
So I was remiss earlier. I didn't tell you. Okay, so out on the tip, we have this piece. I don't know if you can see it. It's like a red string. It's called a Lillian, as in Lily, or my dear Aunt Lillian. And that goes back to, I'm forgetting the full story, but it goes back to a mispronunciation or a material name that was originally made when these were first being produced many years ago. And okay, so the different ways you can do it is you can tie a lot of people tie a knot into their Lillian and then tie a girth hitch. And that works for many people. What I like to do is I like to not tie a knot in my Lillian. I don't want knots in my Lillians because it makes it harder to get the line off and all this stuff. What I like to do is use a poacher's snare, which is essentially kind of like a little bit of a noose. And you run the Lillian through it 3 times and then close that, and it holds very nicely. So I don't have to put knots in my in the Lillian. So there's a couple different ways. Ultimately, you know, it's like whatever method works for you is again fine. Yeah. Next question.
Thanks. Okay, so after this is over, we're all going to be rushing to get in line to get Paul's stop and go pattern. Is that going to work for this, Tenkara?
Absolutely. I've never seen it, but I'll tell you absolutely. Because any fly will, you know, like any fly, you know, and I'll tell you this. So like Tenkara USA was like the first big Tenkara company in the US. And the guy who started, his name was Daniel Gallardo. He's a good guy. And he would tell a story about fishing with his Japanese mentor and how they'd get to a piece of water and they're being ready to rig, and he'd be like, what about this fly? Is this fly good? And be like, good. And basically he finally got to the point, he said, look, any fly is good, man, just tie something on. So, you know, like that's coming down from a legit Tenkara master. So any fly is good, just tie something on. You got one in the back there? That close by? I'm not certain.
Hey, I thought I'd mention I have broken mine.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe you could talk about how to replace them.
Absolutely. That's great. So these things do break, and but you find the more you use them, they break less as you figure out what you're doing. The biggest thing that breaks them is improper closing and opening of the rod. So let's just talk real quick about opening this thing correctly. Pull it outwards 1 section at a time until it's seated. But then most importantly on closing, so I had a Tenkara rod company for 6 years, and I got to the point where I could tell what the customer had done to the rod by where it had broke. And one of the biggest, most noticeable things was that grabbing it by 2 hands when it's stuck and trying to force it together, you get like 2 breaks through here. But these sections do occasionally get stuck. They'll get pulled out, the humidity, you know, the heat, what have you. You need to let it cool down, take it to your basement, let it cool off, dry off if you can. But when you're closing these things, we always want to do it from the bottom section in, just 1 section at a time. Don't rush it, don't force it. And when you open these things up, don't pull them like super, super tight open either, just like finger tight, essentially, so that they're seated. And that will avoid a lot of breaks. But if you do get a break, like, what am I going to do? Do I got to buy a whole new rod? Absolutely not. You just got to do a little surgery. We're all qualified surgeons here, right? Okay, so you know all we got to do is pull this bottom cap off and slide all the sections out. Take out the section that's broke, replace it with the one that you ordered to replace it. It's very simple. Doesn't make me any less clumsy. Next question. Sir. I am not a tippet ring fan because okay, so putting a tippet ring at the end of your line, between your line and your tippet, creates a hinge. And it puts a weight in a place where, like, typically I want that line and that tippet off the water. Typically I'm looking for a fly first or fly only presentation with all that line and tippet up in the water. So me personally, I don't, because like I said, it adds like a weight and a hinging to that, but I know lots of people that do because of the ease it adds to rigging. So you absolutely can. Just be cognizant of that hinging effect, and then be cognizant of its potential to saw your tippet. I don't remember what it was a couple of years ago, but some guys in the community found some tippet rings that were really bad. Essentially, we got into a big discussion about them and everything, but you can use them if you need them to rig up. They can be a great help. I find them to be a little bit of a hindrance in good technique, but it's not something you can't overcome. If an angler can keep floating line off the water, then you can overcome that little hinging there. Just something to be aware of. It's the rock star. What you got?
If could I like go out and fish for pike and muskie with a Tenkara rod?
Yes.
Something you can do.
So pike, awesome. I love that V wake, like they've been launched out of a cannon towards your fly. But toothy creatures, we got a problem with them biting off the line, right? So we played that game for a year or two with the steel bite wire. What we would do is we do a section of line, a section of tippet, and then a section of bite protection. So because we still want that tippet there to break off if we need it to, we want that safety, but we don't want them to be able to bite off. So we used bite wire for a while, but has anyone ever used that steel bite wire? Is that not the biggest pain in the butt possible as far as trying to tie a knot or rig? So what we found was that actually using like a 40 or even 60-pound like saltwater fishing, like mono, like a really heavy mono, was absolutely sufficient for the pike. I don't know about muskie or walleye, but pike, absolutely, it stood up to. And smallmouth bass, that's another concern too. But it stood up to them very well. So definitely want to put a section of bite protection. So you'll go line, tippet, bite protection, fly. Sir? So you can get a decent Tenkara rod for $100. You can get an all-inclusive kit for like 120, 150. If you would, visit tenkaraangler.com and check out our guides and dive through our links. I certainly would appreciate that. Yeah, and I would say even like premium Tenkara rods are top out about like $400 to $500. Now, if you want to spend $3,000 to $4,000 for a salmon, like a Japanese salmon fly fishing pole, they have them. They're like this thick, and they're specific for that. But yeah, $100 to $200 easily to get into good rods. The high end is $400 to $500. You don't have to go buy like a new, $800 Sage or, Helios or whatever every couple of years. Now, a lot of people end up with a lot of Tenkara rods, though. So that can be the problem there, is that they multiply. Sir?
Can you break down the rigging? So you've got this like number 4 level line, then you're doing like a blood knot to tippet. What kind of tippet size? How long is tippet? Is it kind of a standard rig like you'd see?
It is very close to standard, except we don't use leaders. We go straight from our line section to a tippet section.
Sorry, yeah, I said leader, I meant tippet.
Yeah, that's fine. I just want to make that distinction because that can be unclear sometimes. So we go straight to, typically, most of us, and other people don't. Like on this, I dug out this old line because I was filming last week and I wanted something visible, but this has like 2 feet of amnesia, like firewire on the end of the floating line, and then I attached the tippet to that. So some people incorporate tighter sections. Typically, you're going from line to tippet to fly. And that tippet serves two functions. It's stealthy, of course, but it serves as a safety. So the idea is that tippet's gonna break before your rod does. And so like, honestly, I buy 5X all the time. Because like, I have a theory that like, okay, like the whole, I've heard a few different theories or stories about where the whole 5X, 6X thing came from. And my theory is that like 6X is 6 times more of a pain in the butt than 5X. You know, it's like essentially, it's exponentially harder to tie. I stopped at a shop out east a week or two ago to get some 5X tippet. They were out. I got 5.5X. And even that was like unreasonably more difficult for me to deal with than 5X. But long story short, 5X is almost universally sufficient. I will, like when I'm fishing for smallmouth bass, I will save my tippet and I will just use the cheapest 6 or even sometimes 8-pound test Walmart mono that I can throw on there because the bass don't care. In my experience, I keep that tippet for the trout. They do care. Hopefully that answered the question. Okay, so a lot of other Tenkara material will tell it 2 to 3 feet of tippet. I'm a big fan of closer to 4 to 5. What I would say, and you know, when I first started fishing down here in Driftless, we were right in 2 to 3 feet, and we were catching, but not as much as we thought we should. And then we decided we were going to try. Well, let's go with the longest section of tippet we can go and still turn the fly over effectively. That's become our metric, and that typically happens about the 4.5 to 5 feet, maybe a little bit longer, maybe a little bit shorter, depending on the fly you're throwing. But I found that kind of 4 to 5 feet is a very operable length here.
Yeah. Any more questions? Here.
One more. What's your position on line keepers?
It's one more thing for me to lose. Other people use them a lot and spools and stuff. I'm going to tell you, like, I wrap my lines around my handles and stick the hook in the grip, and I can get up and especially like some people have rig, you know, nymphing rigs and stuff. They'll keep on cards and stuff, and it really just kind of depends on how you're playing your game. But absolutely, there are line spools and line holders, some that clip onto the actual blank up here. Yes.
The
Sure.
question is the length of your line, you means the length of your rod plus 4 feet. Can you go, when you get good, can you go double that, or
Yes,
is
so-
there a limit?
So typically, I would recommend a rod length of line plus your tippet, at least as a starting point. But you can push the lines longer, basically to as long as you can still manage. And I'll tell you that Masami Sakakibara, who is known as Oni, or the demon of Tenkara, who is considered to be the greatest living Tenkara angler, who was from Japan. I'm sorry, what was can you please? Oh, the length of the rod. He practices with like 25 and 30 meter lines, like 40 to 50 foot lines on like a 12-foot rod. He practices with it. Now, I've never seen anyone fish with that much line. I've seen him fish with longer lines, but he practices with it. So basically, you can. I fished. I get to talk about how far I've stretched it personally. On a 13-foot rod, I've fished like a 20-foot line plus 5-6 feet of tippet. That was out on the Wisconsin River. I was throwing poppers at smallmouth bass, but I was able to move it, you know, if you got the room. But typically on a lot of these driftless streams, you know, your typical rating is about all you've got room for. But you can push it as far as you want, and it's highly recommended. You know, a lot of us in the community do practice on, you know, kind of at home daily casting and stuff like that. And yeah, like go as long as you can, because then you come back to a regular length and you're just on it.
Any more questions in the audience? Okay.
Okay, we have a couple of more questions in the chat. These folks have very interesting questions. They want you to talk about tap, tap, and pon pon.
Okay. So manipulation technique, pon pon and tap tap. And frankly, I gotta tell you, there are Japanese terms for a lot of these techniques that frankly escape me very often. And if I'm getting pon pon correct, it's essentially just tapping on the rod with your finger like this. A little bit what I was talking about earlier, tap, 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 tap type of manipulation. But again, that's another, when you've got a tight line, that all translates into motion on the bottom, on the fly there. And so like, let's talk about power curve. Okay, so there is, and it kind of goes back to where we're talking about where the rods flex. So there's a sweet spot in that where the rod flexes, where you want, basically where you can kind of hold and control the fish, because it, any direction it moves, it's resisted. And so what you don't want to, you always want to try to get that fish and the rod into the power curve while you're playing it. But what you don't want to do is end up with an open or closed curve. Okay, so a closed curve would be if I have this rod all the way out and I were to put back down and close the loop down here, if that makes sense. And what that would do is that would snap the tip. It absolutely would. Now, these things are super durable when they're fully extended and the weight's being applied the way it's designed to. You'll be surprised what size fish and what kind of current you can withstand with these rods. But if I were to right now just to like do that on that section, it would totally break because it's not able to distribute the power through the energy through the rest of the rod. So we don't want to go into a closed curve, and we don't want to get into an open curve where we've got the rod like this, and essentially the fish is almost straight in front of us. And you end up with breaking the lower part of the rod that way. So we want to keep the rod up, we want to keep tension on the rod, and we want to ride that power curve. It's difficult without really demonstrating it. But I should look for some good footage of that. That's something I really should have good footage of. Do we have any other questions?
There's more questions from the chat. Somebody did mention that when they're like walking with the rod, that they'll wrap that extra line section around their hand.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Because otherwise that fly will get caught on everything. So just get it in your hand or wrap it around your hand. If that's all the questions you have, folks, before I go outside to do the demonstration, just let me say thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you. So let's go outside and cast.
Hey, we want to give you a gift.
Oh.
Thank you for coming out and speaking on behalf of the TU group here. So,
Well, thank you.
applause, guys.
Wow.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Should I open this? Okay. Wow.
Want them to open it up, Bob, or what?
It's like Christmas up in here. Oh, very cool. Thank you for being so welcoming. It's very kind. Thank you.
All right. Anything else? Any other closing statements, Bob? Wow. Okay. Well, I'm a little nervous. I'm probably going to mess up right now, but thank you for coming out, guys. If you guys want to go outside and check out the casting stuff and drink some more beers, that'd be a big help.
Nice.
How do you usually close it, Bob?
Awesome.
That's it.
Thank
you
you.
for coming out, guys, and we'll see you next month. Yeah.
Thanks.
Good enough.
All right.